There is a particular kind of financial frustration that does not make the news. It does not involve bankruptcy, foreclosure, or a dramatic collapse of any kind. It is quieter than that, and in many ways more difficult to name. Consider someone earning $42,000 a year, or 60, or even 80. The salary is not the problem. The rent is paid. The car runs. The grocery bill is manageable most weeks by most external measures. This person is doing fine. And yet, by the middle of the month, the account balance has drifted down to a number that produces a specific, familiar anxiety. Not panic, just a low hum of unease. There is no gambling habit to explain it, no secret addiction, no catastrophic emergency that drained the savings. There's only the ordinary cost of living a normal life, compounded by dozens of decisions made each week that felt individually completely reasonable. A lunch out because the morning was rushed. A streaming subscription that never quite got canceled. A pair of shoes purchased on a Tuesday afternoon for reasons that seemed clear at the time but are harder to articulate now. An impulse upgrade on a phone that still worked. A weekend trip that went slightly over budget. None of these things on their own would register as a financial mistake. Together, they form a pattern, and that pattern has a name: lifestyle spending without structure. What makes this situation so persistent is not a lack of income. It is not a lack of intelligence. The people who find themselves in this position are often educated, capable, and genuinely hardworking. They know, in the abstract, that they should save more. They have heard about compound interest. They have seen the retirement calculators. They understand that time matters. And yet, month after month, the savings account stays roughly the same. Sometimes it grows a little. Sometimes it shrinks. The reason, and this is what most financial advice gets wrong, is not a knowledge problem. It is a behavior problem. And behavior is not changed by learning more information. It is changed by building different systems. The financial industry has spent decades producing content that tells people what they should do. Save more, spend less, invest early, diversify, avoid debt. All of this is technically correct. None of it is particularly useful, because knowing what to do and actually doing it are two entirely different cognitive experiences. One happens in the rational, deliberate part of the brain. The other happens in the automatic, habitual part. And the automatic part wins, almost every time. This is not a video about what you should do. It is a video about 5 small behavioral shifts, each of them grounded in what we understand about how human decision-making actually works, that quietly and consistently reshape a person's financial trajectory over time. Not overnight, not dramatically, not through sacrifice or discipline, or any particularly heroic act of willpower. Just 5 habits, applied consistently, compounding in the background of an ordinary life. What if 5 small habits could quietly change your entire financial future? Before examining the habits themselves, it is worth spending a moment on the underlying mechanism, because there is a tendency, especially in a culture that celebrates dramatic transformation, to dismiss small actions as insufficient. This tendency is understandable but deeply mistaken. Behavioral economics, the discipline that studies how humans actually make decisions rather than how they theoretically should, has produced one finding above all others that is relevant here. People are not rational actors. They do not weigh options carefully, calculate long-term consequences, and select the objectively optimal path. They operate largely on autopilot, guided by defaults, emotions, social comparison, and cognitive shortcuts that evolve for an environment very different from the one we currently inhabit. This means that financial behavior is not primarily determined by knowledge or intention. It is determined by context, by environment, by what is easy and what requires effort, by what is visible and what is hidden, by what feels urgent and what feels distant. Change the context, and you change the behavior, often without requiring any additional willpower at all. James Clear, in his work on habit formation, described this as the difference between outcome-based thinking and identity-based thinking. Most people try to change their financial lives by setting outcome-based goals. Save $10,000. Pay off the credit card. Reach a certain net worth. These goals are not useless, But they are fragile because they depend entirely on sustained motivation, which is not a reliable resource. Identity-based thinking works differently. Instead of asking what you want to achieve, it asks who you are becoming. A person who sees themselves as someone who does not spend before saving will behave differently than someone who sees themselves as trying to save more. The habit becomes an expression of identity rather than an act of discipline. This reframing matters because it removes the moral dimension from financial behavior. Spending impulsively is not a character flaw. It is a natural response to an environment designed to produce exactly that behavior. Retailers, app designers, and the entire architecture of modern commerce are optimized to reduce friction between desire and purchase. The person who overspends is not weak. They are simply operating in an environment that was carefully engineered against them without any corresponding system on their side. The 5 habits in this video are structural interventions. They change the environment rather than demanding more from the person. They reduce the number of decisions that need to be made. They exploit the same psychological mechanisms that currently work against financial health and redirect them in a more useful direction. There is also a mathematical reality worth naming. Consistency at a moderate level almost always outperforms intensity applied irregularly. A person who saves $200 every month for 30 years, invested in a simple index fund returning 7% annually, ends up with over $240,000. The math is not the point. The point is that the behavior required to produce this outcome is not heroic. It is boring. It is automatic. It requires no sustained motivation, no sacrifice of lifestyle, and no financial expertise beyond the decision to set it up. The difference between financial stability and financial precarity, for most middle-class people, is rarely a difference in income. It is a difference in behavior. And behavior at scale is shaped by habit, not by intention. There's a principle in behavioral economics called default bias. It describes a well-documented human tendency to accept whatever option is presented as a default rather than actively choosing an alternative. When a new employee is automatically enrolled in a retirement savings plan, participation rates are typically above 90%. When enrollment requires an active decision, rates often fall below 40%. The underlying math is identical. The only thing that changes is which option requires effort. This principle is the entire foundation of Habit 1. Automate the transfer of money before you have the opportunity to spend it. The conventional model of personal savings goes something like this. A person receives their paycheck. They pay their bills. They spend on whatever needs to be spent on. And if anything remains at the end of the month, they save it. This model sounds reasonable. It is in practice nearly useless because discretionary spending has a well-documented tendency to expand to fill available funds. The money rarely remains. There's always something else. The savings category becomes a residual, perpetually first in theory and last in practice. The inverted model, often described as paying yourself first, works precisely because it removes a decision entirely. The money is transferred automatically, on payday, to a separate account or investment vehicle before it enters the mental accounting of available spending money. It never appears in the checking account. It is, for practical psychological purposes, as if it was never there. What makes this powerful is not the amount. It is the structure. Someone who automated transfer of $150 per month, invested consistently over 25 years at a 7% average annual return, accumulates approximately $120,000. Someone who intends to invest but relies on monthly willpower to do so will, the research consistently shows, invest far less consistently, and arrive at a meaningfully different outcome. The friction reduction here is not trivial. Every financial decision that requires active deliberation is a decision that must compete with the hundreds of other demands on cognitive resources in any given day. Fatigue, stress, distraction, urgency, and a dozen other factors all reduce the quality of deliberate choices. Automation removes a decision from this competitive environment entirely. It happens in the background, without attention, without effort, and without the possibility of being derailed by a bad week at work or an unexpected expense that suddenly makes the savings transfer feel like an unnecessary luxury. The setup itself requires one deliberate act, a conversation with a bank or brokerage, establishing an automatic transfer on a specific date each month. Many employers allow direct deposit to be split between accounts, making even this step minimal. The return on this single hour of administrative effort, compounded over decades, is difficult to overstate. There is also a psychological adaptation that occurs over time. When the automated savings are consistent, the brain recalibrates its sense of normal. The available spending balance becomes a reference point, not the gross income. The adaptation happens automatically, without requiring sustained awareness or effort. What initially felt like a reduction in available money simply becomes a new baseline. This is a nature default bias working in your favor. Once automation is established, inertia maintains it. The same psychological tendency that keeps people enrolled in whatever option was selected for them at the beginning now keeps the savings transfer running month after month, year after year, without requiring any additional decision, motivation, or willpower at all. The question to consider is not whether you can afford to automate a transfer. The question is what happens to the money if you do not. It gets spent, not on anything dramatic, on the ordinary, invisible accumulation of daily costs that leave no trace and produce no lasting value. The automated transfer is not a sacrifice. It is a redirection from spending that was barely noticed to wealth that quietly accumulates. In 2019, researchers at Tilburg University conducted a study on the relationship between emotional state and impulse purchasing behavior. Their findings were not surprising to anyone who has spent time in a shopping mall after a difficult day, but they were remarkably consistent. Negative emotional states, including stress, boredom, loneliness, and mild anxiety, significantly increased the likelihood of unplanned purchases. And crucially, those purchases do not reliably improve the emotional state they were intended to address. This is the psychological architecture of impulse spending. It is not primarily about desire for the object being purchased. It is about the momentary relief provided by the act of deciding, selecting, and acquiring. The brain releases a small quantity of dopamine in anticipation of the purchase, not in response to actually owning the thing. This is why the item often feels less satisfying than expected once it arrives. The neurological reward was already collected at the moment of decision. Habit 2 is a structural intervention designed to interrupt this cycle. The 24-hour rule for any non-essential purchase above a specified threshold. The mechanics are simple. Before buying anything that is not food, fuel, or a committed recurring expense, wait 24 hours. Write it down if that helps. Leave the browser tab open. Add it to a list. Then, one day later, make the decision with full information and a clearer emotional state. What this rule exploits is the temporal dynamics of desire. Most impulse purchases feel urgent. Not urgent in the sense of genuine need, but urgent in the emotional sense that the wanting feels immediate and the waiting feels like loss. What the research consistently shows, however, is that this urgency dissipates rapidly with time. Studies on the delay of gratification literature show that desires that feel overwhelming in the moment typically reduce significantly within 12 to 24 hours, often without any additional effort or distraction. The wanting simply fades. The threshold for applying this rule is personal and should be realistic. Some people set it at $50, others at $100. The specific number matters less than the consistency of application. The rule should be applied automatically without case-by-case judgment, because case-by-case judgment is exactly the cognitive process that impulse spending undermines. Consider a practical example. A person browses an online retailer on a Sunday evening after a stressful week at work. They add 2 items to a cart, totaling $120. Under normal conditions, the purchase would be completed that evening, driven by the low-grade emotional reward of the decision itself. Under the 24-hour rule, the purchase is deferred. On Monday morning, in a different emotional state, with different cognitive resources available, the person revisits the cart. In a meaningful percentage of cases, they decide not to buy, not because the items are objectively worthless, but because the desire is diminished to a point where the value no longer justifies the cost. Over the course of a year, this habit produces significant aggregate savings without requiring any sustained deprivation. The items that pass the 24-hour test are still purchased. The person's life is not impoverished. What is eliminated is a category of spending that is driven primarily by emotional state and would not have been chosen under more deliberate conditions. There is also a secondary benefit that compounds over time. The habit gradually retrains a relationship between emotional discomfort and the purchase response. When the automatic connection between feeling bad and buying something is repeatedly interrupted, it weakens. The impulse diminishes. Eventually, the 24-hour rule requires less conscious enforcement because the impulse itself has become less automatic. This is not willpower. It is a deliberate restructuring of a behavioral pattern through consistent friction, applied at the precise moment when the old pattern would otherwise engage. The personal finance industry has a complexity problem. An enormous quantity of financial advice is dedicated to elaborate systems of categorization, tracking, and optimization. Monthly budgets with 17 categories. Spreadsheets that capture every transaction in precise detail. Apps that send notifications when a particular spending category exceeds its weekly allocation. The underlying logic is that more information leads to better decisions. This logic, applied carefully in financial modeling and institutional portfolio management, does not transfer cleanly to individual human behavior. Research on compliance with complex behavioral systems is consistently discouraging. People begin with enthusiasm, maintain the system for a few weeks, encounter a period of disruption or inconvenience, and abandon it. The system then carries a residual association with failure, making the next attempt psychologically more difficult. Complexity is the enemy of consistency, and consistency is the only financial variable that actually compounds. Habit 3 is a radical simplification. Track one number only. That number is your savings rate, expressed as percentage of gross income. Nothing else. If you earn $4,000 per month and move $600 into savings or investments, your savings rate is 15%. That is the number, not how much you spent on dining, not how your grocery bill compares to last month, not whether your entertainment spending is under or over the line you drew in the spreadsheet, just the percentage of income that leaves the spending ecosystem before it can be consumed. The reason this works is not that savings rate is the only financially relevant metric. It is that savings rate is the most important metric, and tracking it requires almost no effort. A single monthly calculation, taking approximately 90 seconds. The result tells you everything you need to know about whether your financial behavior is moving in the right direction. If the savings rate is going up, the system is working. Spend the rest however you choose, without guilt or elaborate tracking. If the savings rate is going down, something in the spending pattern has shifted. That is a signal to investigate further, not as a default monthly exercise, but as a targeted response to a specific change. There is a psychological benefit to this simplicity that extends beyond compliance. Elaborate budgeting systems have an unintended consequence. They shift attention from the macro direction of financial behavior to the micro details of individual transactions. The person who obsessively tracks coffee purchases but misses the slow drift of their savings rate upward due to lifestyle inflation has the measurement entirely backward. The detail obscures the trend. A secondary option, for those who find savings rate abstract, is the monthly surplus, the dollar amount remaining after all expenses are paid and before discretionary spending. This number is less precise, but equally directional. If it is growing, financial flexibility is increasing. If it is shrinking, something needs a change. The broader principle here is that financial clarity is not the same as financial complexity. Many people who track nothing feel anxious and uncertain about their money. Many people who track everything feel equally anxious and uncertain, because the volume of data does not produce the peace of mind that simplicity does. What produces calm is a clear, reliable signal about whether the overall direction is correct. One number, tracked consistently, is a clearer signal than 17 numbers tracked sporadically. The reduction in friction is not merely convenient. It is the mechanism that makes the habit sustainable over years rather than weeks.